The other day, we eulogized the political career of the great Jasmine Crockett of Texas. She lost her bid to be the Democrats' nominee in the Senate primary, a race that she felt compelled to join because Republicans gerrymandered her congressional district away. In other words, because Republicans redrew the congressional map, Jasmine Crockett had to choose between running for a totally new congressional seat or running for the Senate. You can't run for both seats at the same time. And she chose the Senate, and she lost. And as a result, her political career is likely over. Now, as tragic as Jasmine's defeat is, she was by far the most entertaining member of Congress who can barely speak English. There's a bigger story here. Jasmine Crockett's defeat is part of a major shift in American politics, and it really doesn't get enough attention. For decades since the civil rights era, Democrats have been allowed to draw and redraw congressional maps in order to boost black representation in Congress. So if a district was 80% white, Democrats could redraw the district in absurd ways so that more black people who overwhelmingly vote Democrat were included. And that's what happened in Louisiana. To give just one example, we'll put this ridiculous map up on the screen. I think we've shown it before. A federal court forced Louisiana to draw a district across the entire length of the state solely to include more black people. This is what happens in many different states. Essentially, Democrats have been allowed to dilute the white vote, knowing full well that non-white voters tend to side with Democrats. Now, this is cheating, of course, but under the guise of racial equity, courts have allowed it. But that's all ending now. All over the country, because of federal court decisions and Supreme Court rulings, Republicans are being allowed to redraw congressional districts that have been rigged for years. So they're basically unrigging these districts. And this is called gerrymandering. And yes, Republicans are explicitly drawing the districts in order to maximize their political advantage. There's nothing unusual about that, nothing illegal or unethical about it. Both parties do it. It's how the game is played. The difference is that for the first time in 50 years, Democrats don't get to scream racism and stop Republicans from gerrymandering. A bigger Supreme Court ruling on the issue is pending, and if it goes the way we think it will, Democrats stand to lose around 24 seats in Congress. So it's a very big deal. But already the impact is being felt. Jasmine Crockett is done, and the man who defeated her in the Democrat U.S. Senate primary, James Talarico, is now being touted as a moderate Democrat who has a real chance of flipping the state of Texas. No Democrat, by the way, has won a Senate race in Texas in about 50 years. But according to Stephen Colbert and the DNC and MSNBC and everybody else in the mainstream left, Talarico can do it. He's the guy. And that's because, as MSNBC reminded us yesterday, Talarico is supposedly a moderate candidate who will win over independents and, non-political voters. And he's so sane and normal and moderate that he's a big tent. He's a big tent guy, a big tent candidate, we're told. Watch.
What is the sense in Texas of how James Talarico upset Crockett?
Yeah, so Congresswoman Crockett definitely came into this race with the name recognition, and these two candidates were fairly similar in terms of their policy positions, but they had two very different pitches for voters. Crockett really pitched herself as a fighter, someone who was going to take on Donald Trump and stand for Democrats, whereas State Representative James Talarico was talking about taking on economic and political systems that are run by billionaires, saying that, yes, he was going to take on Trump, but also that he was pitching himself as sort of this big tent Democrat who would bring in independents, who could bring in disaffected Republicans, whereas Representative Crockett was really focused on bringing in and juicing the Democratic voter turnout. And so two very different strategies there.
Now, this idea that Talarico is a down-the-middle politician with broad appeal is everywhere. Leslie Marshall, who's on Fox News all the time, as a political strategist, called Talarico a more moderate option. Newsweek describes Talarico as a rising Democrat and a moderate focused on economic populism and broad voter appeal. This is how they sold Talarico to left-wing Democrats in Texas. Talarico, Democrats were told, was the sane and rational alternative to Jasmine Crockett. So white liberal women cast their votes for Talarico, even as they openly wept about the fact that they were oppressing a strong, independent woman of color. Watch.
So yes, we need a fighter. And I was so ready to vote for Jasmine Crockett because I love her. But I voted for Talarico because we need somebody who can win.
Yeah, it's just a shame. We love her so much, but we love this black woman and we want black women in positions of power. But, here was one that we had to deprive her of that position of power for the greater good is what they're saying. And, it's easy for conservatives to be pessimistic right now as the midterm election season begins. Midterm elections generally don't go well for the party that controls Congress and the White House. Historically, the incumbent party loses a lot of seats. We all know that. That's how it's worked, especially in recent years. And although the polling looks pretty good for Republicans right now, the expectation is that things will shift, as they tend to do, towards the Democrats as we get closer to November. But despite all that pessimism, I will make a prediction. Now that the Democrat Party establishment is seriously trying to run candidates like James Talarico with the messaging that they're normal and moderate and appeal to a big tent, it's very likely the Democrats will not know what hit them in November. If this is how they're going to play it, if this is the guy that the Democrats' political operation is going to rally behind on the theory that he's totally relatable to the average person in Texas, of all places, then this party is probably toast in the midterms. Now, James Talarico is not simply a far-left activist who's never worked a real job in his life, although he is that. He's not simply a creepy-looking heretic and fake pastor who pathologically lies to Christians over and over again about what Scripture says. Now, James Talarico is all those things, as we'll discuss in a moment, but he's also completely insane. He genuinely makes Jasmine Crockett out to be totally normal. In a race between the two of them, she is actually the normal and moderate one by comparison. That's how bad this guy is. Talarico's rise as a moderate was such a con job, such a flagrant bait and switch that even now, it's likely that most Democrats don't realize exactly what just transpired. So let's fill them in. We'll start with this post from James Talarico on May 8th of 2020. This is what he tweeted in the context of complaining about alleged cases of police brutality, which were not in fact police brutality. He says that these non-brutality cases are symptoms of the virus of racism and adds this, quote, white skin gives me and every white American immunity from the virus, but we spread it wherever we go through our words, our actions, and our systems. We don't have to be showing symptoms like a white hood or a Confederate flag to be contagious. Now, and then he continues, he says, quote, the only cure is diagnosing the virus within ourselves and taking dramatic actions to contain the spread. The first small step is proclaiming loudly and unequivocally that hashtag Black Lives Matter. Now, we've all become accustomed to hyperbolic and deranged rhetoric from the left. We all know how often these people will beclown themselves in the service of their ideology. But even with that in mind, I mean, this is something special. The Democrat nominee for U.S. Senate in Texas just a few years ago declared that white people, simply by virtue of their genetics, spread racism wherever they go like a virus in everything they do. He declared that we are all carriers of a virus. He's saying that white people in every case are a plague on society because they are white and therefore diseased. And by the same token, he's saying that it's impossible for a white person to be victimized because of the color of his skin. White people, according to this guy, cannot be discriminated against. They cannot be the victims of hate crimes. It's not unjust to punish whites for being white because in his worldview, being white is itself a crime against nature, or at the very least, as he puts it, a disease. But put mildly, this is not going to play well in Texas, nor should it. In a sane Democrat party, these posts alone would be disqualifying. The African warlords who chant "kill the Boer," I mean, even they would find James Talarico to be a little too on the nose. I mean, even they would tell him to tone it down a little bit. But for Democrats, Talarico is apparently the best they have to offer. So they're going to present him as a moderate, even though he thinks that tens of millions of Texans carry a virus because of the color of their skin. Now, to be clear, this is a much bigger problem for Talarico than just this one post. He's also on the record declaring that prison is violence and that we should imagine a world where prisons don't exist at all. Watch.
Poverty is violence. Pollution is violence. And yes, prison is violence. Dismantle this system of violence, build something new, something better, something rooted in love. It's hard to imagine a world without prisons, but it's also hard to imagine a world without telegrams and cassette tapes. Just because it's hard to imagine doesn't mean you shouldn't.
Prison is violence. It's hard to imagine a world without prisons. Just because it's hard to imagine doesn't mean you shouldn't. This is the message that the National Democrats have just committed to. This is what they view as moderate. They're trying to suggest that abolishing prisons, a policy that would obviously destroy society and lead to the deaths of thousands of people, that is a big tent policy. Let's go poll that one. Maybe Reuters can go poll that one. What do American citizens feel? How do you feel about abolishing prisons? Now, needless to say, of course, if we abolish the prisons, which is what James wants us to do, James himself will not be living in the neighborhoods where the freed convicts will be settling. We know that. And he has a lot of other big ideas, including the notion that there are somehow 6 biological sexes. Watch.
I want us all to be aware of is that modern science obviously recognizes that there are many more than 2 biological sexes. In fact, there are 6, which honestly, Representative Hefner surprised me too. Surprised me too, because I am not well versed in this issue area. I'm not a scientist. I'm a politician, a lot worse than a scientist.
So he says it's obvious that there are 6 biological sexes according to modern science. So there's the arrogance we're all familiar with from these people. And then he suggests that modern science is infallible. So we all need to agree that effective immediately there are 6 biological sexes. Unfortunately, he doesn't provide the names of those 6 biological sexes, which is what we always find with these people that say there's more than one sex. They can never name it. But as best I can tell, he's referring to people with chromosomal disorders like Turner syndrome, where children are born without the typical XX or XY chromosomes. A child might be born with a single X chromosome, for example. This doesn't mean that the child belongs to a new biological sex, obviously. What it means is that the child has a developmental abnormality that exists within the established sex binary. And we know that because these developmental abnormalities do not lead to the creation of new reproductive cells or reproductive pathways, which is the definition of a biological sex. If you're a member of a distinct biological sex, it means that your body creates distinct reproductive cells that, when combined with other reproductive cells from another biological sex, create a new organism. So put another way, somebody with a developmental disorder might produce eggs or sperm, or neither, in which case they'd be infertile or sterile. But they don't produce a third type of cell that enables the creation of a new organism, and it's absurd to suggest otherwise. Now, what's important to understand about Talarico, and this might be why some Democrats were fooled into thinking that he was a moderate, is that he will deliver complete falsehoods with total sincerity. I mean, he'll look you in the eye very calmly and just lie with impunity. And the more you listen, the more unsettling it becomes. For example, watch how he voiced his opposition to a bill that would prevent boys from competing in girls' sports. Let's see exactly why Talarico wants men to compete against women. Here it is.
Before my constituents elected me to this body, I taught middle school. And my students are the reason I'm here, to make public policy that improves their lives. But instead, we're doing this, endangering the lives of some of our most vulnerable children to solve a problem that doesn't exist. When she laid out this bill in front of the Public Education Committee, Representative Swanson summed up the justification for this legislation in one sentence. She said, "If one girl loses a game, this bill is worth it." I guess we just have a different moral yardstick. Because I say if one trans child dies to protect someone's damn trophy, this bill is grotesque. Is both masculine and feminine and everything in between. God is non-binary. Trans children are God's children, made in God's own image. There's nothing wrong with them. Nothing at all. They are perfect, they are beautiful, and they are sacred. Bullying children is immoral. It's a sin, a special kind of sin.
Well, there it is. If you don't let a boy play in girls' sports, then you're responsible if the boy decides to kill himself over it. And trans children are perfect and sacred, even though nobody's perfect. So it's not, I mean, already, children are perfect. No, they're not. Like, that's the least of our concerns, but that is also definitely not Christian teaching that anyone is perfect. But anyway, he says they're perfect and sacred, which is why we need to pump their bodies full of hormones that sterilize them and cut apart their bodies because they're perfect and sacred. And, oh, by the way, if you are not on board with gender ideology, then you're not a real Christian because God is non-binary. Now, if you actually care about the well-being of children or if you care about Christianity, which most Texans do in both cases, then both of these statements are not simply wrong. They are appalling. They are, speaking of grotesque, they make normal people react with disgust and revulsion. Now, if you think a child is going to kill himself because he can't join the girls' team, the appropriate solution is to that problem is not to let him join the girls' team. It's to address the profound mental instability that would cause a boy to believe he's a girl and to want to die in service of that delusion. And that's not even getting into the fact that the ACLU's very own trans-identifying attorney, Chase Strangio, has admitted before the Supreme Court that there's no evidence anywhere that affirming a child's subjective sense of quote-unquote gender actually reduces suicide rates. So logic, basic morality, all the data, all of that contradicts everything that James Talarico is saying. Then you get to the part where he says God is non-binary, which has to rank pretty high in terms of heresies. Even for James Talarico, he outdid himself on that one. Imagine taking an incoherent, meaningless, made-up concept that was created on Tumblr a few years ago for the benefit of delusional narcissists and saying that God fell for the same propaganda. Now, the problem, of course, is that when humans declare that they're non-binary, they aren't actually changing the fact that they're human beings with a biological sex. They're simply declaring out loud that they don't identify with their biological sex, whatever that means, and that everyone needs to give them as much attention as possible. And that's really what they're asking for. That's what being non-binary means in practice. It means absolutely nothing, in reality. God, on the other hand, is not a disgruntled, unemployed teenager on Tumblr. The thing about non-binary is that if it were a real thing, which it definitely isn't, it would be a part of the biological system that God created. God transcends the system that he creates. Talarico is basically arguing that God transcends the system by being a part of it and subject to it, which makes no sense. But anyway, non-binary is not part of the system. It's a made-up concept, made up by humans, not by God. Not the God who created us male and female and thought that that fact was so important to get across to us that it's one of the very first things we're told in the Bible. What James Talarico is doing, and he's not being very subtle about it, is bringing Gnostic heresy to the mainstream. He wants to convince Democrats that they can still consider themselves to be Christians even as they support the murder, sterilization, and castration of children. He wants to convince Democrats that they can still consider themselves to be Christians even as they deliberately unleash violent criminals on innocent men, women, and children. He wants to convince Democrats they can still consider themselves Christians even as they reject every core tenet of Christianity. The Gnostic element is, I think, important to emphasize here. Gnostics are heretics who believe that the physical world is evil. They don't believe that Jesus' resurrection changed anything. They believe in total separation of the soul and the body. It's a heresy that underlies a lot of trans ideology, actually, and it's what Talarico promotes in his fake sermons at his satanic temple masquerading as a church. Watch.
Being Christian and being pro-choice are absolutely consistent because Christianity is a feminist religion. Our oldest scriptures, 3,000 years old, reject embryonic personhood while affirming female personhood. In fact, modern mass Christian opposition to abortion is a relatively new phenomenon. The Southern Baptist Convention itself was pro-choice until the 1980s. Feminist, womanist theologians are helping us remember Christianity's feminist tradition, a tradition that has been obscured and hidden by generations of men. Did they teach you in Sunday school that men and women are created equally in the book of Genesis? Did they teach you in Sunday school that the Bible sometimes describes God as a female, calling her Sophia? Did they teach you in Sunday school that Jesus Christ himself was a radical feminist? I don't claim to know what Jesus thought about abortion. He never mentions it either, which maybe that should tell us something right there. In the Gospel of Thomas, which was later omitted from the Bible by church officials, the Gospel of Thomas quotes Jesus as saying, when you make the male and female one and the same, when the male is not male, when the female is not female, then you will enter the kingdom of God.
Well, it's hard to know where to begin with this. The so-called Gospel of Thomas, which wasn't written until the mid-2nd century and which wasn't actually written by Thomas or anyone who knew Thomas or anyone who knew someone who knew Thomas, is a collection of Gnostic heresies. I mean, really, it's a collection of disconnected and incoherent statements that contradict the actual Gospels, which is why it's not in the Bible. And in particular, it stands for the proposition, actually, that women can't enter the kingdom of heaven. That's the actual point of the passage he's quoting, incredibly. In an effort to make a feminist point, he's citing a text that explicitly denies that females can enter the kingdom of heaven. And he's quoting it in a favorable way. He's saying we should give credence to this text because he can twist the language around to make it sound like an endorsement of 21st century gender ideology. And it should tell you something that these people who, and by the way, all of these heretics who try to make these claims about God's non-binary, the Bible is feminist, this is where they're pulling a lot of it from. It's from apocryphal texts that are not actually in the Bible. And that should tell you something. There's also the incredibly dumb argument that the Bible never mentions abortion as a way of arguing that abortion is somehow compatible with Christianity. I guess there's supposed to be an appendix to the Bible where it explicitly lists all of the 20 million ways you can kill someone. You know, and if your preferred method of murder isn't in the appendix, that means that it's fine. And under James Talarico's understanding of theology, if your specific method of murder isn't on the list, then you're good to go. Because the Bible is silent on the topic of whether or not you're allowed to drop a piano on somebody's head to kill them. Well, that means you can drop a piano on somebody's head. Drop a piano on their head and kill them. And then someone says, well, that's not a Christian thing to do. What do you mean? Jesus never says you can't do that. Very, very curiously, Jesus never says you can't drop a piano on someone's head. Maybe that should tell us something. I mean, if Jesus didn't want us to drop pianos on people's heads, then he would have said specifically in the Sermon on the Mount, and also, by the way, don't drop pianos on people's heads. That's the logic. Meanwhile, the Bible does explicitly forbid murder, actually, which covers abortion. And it explicitly states that unborn children are humans created in the womb by God. Not to mention the fact that Jesus Christ himself began his life on earth as an unborn child in the womb. So abortion is not only incompatible with the Bible, but it is in many ways the most incompatible thing you could possibly imagine. Just pick up the Bible and read it sometime. Psalm 139 states that God knitted me together in my mother's womb. Luke states that when Mary arrives, Elizabeth's unborn child, quote, leaped in my womb for joy. And I could go on. So Talarico uses the same argument, of course, to justify his support for same-sex marriage. He says that the Bible doesn't talk about same-sex marriage, and therefore it's permissible. As Robert Gagnon at the Wesley Biblical Seminary has pointed out in response to Talarico in a lengthy tweet, there's a very superficial, at best, and idiotic way to read the scripture. Quote, the reason why Jesus and biblical writers didn't talk about quote unquote gay marriage was the same reason why they didn't talk about marriage with your mother or sibling or child. Any sexual behavior of the sort, whether in a one-time act or an attempt at a committed relationship, was prohibited as an extreme sexual sin, abhorrent and detestable to God. Jesus thought that a male-female prerequisite for marriage was so important that he used it as the foundation for rejecting any sexual bond involving more than two persons, whether concurrent or serial. According to Jesus, the two-ness of the sexes, the sexual binary, God's intentional design of two and only two sexual counterparts, is the basis for limiting the number of persons in a marriage to two. That's Jesus' moral logic behind his citation of male and female, he made them. Now, what heretics do in every case is disregard the teachings of the Bible in favor of grotesque misrepresentations. They of course start with the conclusion that they want to draw, and then they go through the entire Bible and they just pick the little pieces of it here and there. Of course, not even taking into account context or what in any specific passage is meant to address in the context, or what this passage is actually trying to do. Because you have many different types of, the Bible is a compilation of many different types of writing over the course of hundreds of years. But if you're somebody like James Talarico, you can just pick up the Bible and just kind of flip through the pages, and you find one little sentence here and one little word there and a sentence over here, and you just kind of stitch it together, and you find what you're looking for. And if you can't find it in there, well, then that's no problem, because you can just throw the Bible aside and then go looking through like apocryphal texts and heretical texts and things that aren't even in the Bible, and you can find what you're looking for in there. That's what they do. And Talarico keeps doing it. Watch.
And when a woman decides to do theology instead of doing housework, Jesus affirms her decision. Jesus honors her choice. In fact, the only person to ever beat Jesus in a debate in the Bible was the Syrophoenician woman. Think about that. The only person to teach Jesus something was a woman. Even the Son of God had something to learn from one of God's daughters. The church should start to listen to them again.
Okay, so this is another ridiculous lie. There is no debate that takes place in the Bible where a woman outwits Jesus in some kind of intellectual argument. There is no debate in the Bible where Jesus loses the argument to anyone, man or woman. There is a test of faith, which is what he's referring to, the passage is referring to, where Jesus suggests to his disciples that a Canaanite woman, as a Gentile, wouldn't benefit from his teachings, and the woman states that she would, in fact, benefit, using a clever turn of phrase and context, and Jesus is happy with her response. It's a way of demonstrating that his teachings aren't just for Jews. But, to James Talarico, this is a sign that Jesus was totally owned by the woman. He didn't see it coming, right? And it's a sign that the Bible is really a piece of third wave feminist literature. He has reduced the scripture, mangled and perverted it, all for the sake of propping up like the modern girl boss fantasy. He constantly makes many other misrepresentations along these lines. And here's another one. This is when he was on with Joe Rogan a few months ago. And this is James Talarico using the Annunciation to justify abortion.
But I say all this in context of abortion because before God comes over Mary and we have the incarnation, God asks for Mary's consent, which is remarkable. I mean, go back and read this in Luke. I mean, the angel comes down and asks Mary if this is something she wants to do, and she says, "If it is God's will, let it be done. Let it be. Let it happen." So to me, that is an affirmation in one of our most central stories that creation has to be done with consent. You cannot force someone to create. Creation is one of the most sacred acts that we engage in as human beings, but that has to be done with consent. It has to be done with freedom, and to me, that is absolutely consistent with the ministry and life and death of Jesus. And so that's how I come down on that side of the issue.
Oh, that's how you come down on that side. So you come down on that side of the issue by lying. You know, the way I come down on my side of the issue is by lying. The way I come down on it is actually by being full of completely. So again, where do you begin with this? I mean, even if he is, if his reading of Luke was correct, which it's not, it still doesn't help make his case. Women, in the vast majority of cases, consent to the sexual act that leads to the conception of their child. So women are providing consent to the reproductive act, which results in reproduction. And they're doing that in the way that James Talarico is claiming that Mary consented to the to conception. But Talarico supports abortion at any time for any reason. I mean, he's not simply advocating for abortion in cases of rape. He's advocating for abortion on demand across the board. And not to mention the fact that abortion, as I've covered so many times, abortion is not even the prevention of conception. That's not what we're talking about. I mean, he's equating what he's trying to do is say that if Mary had said no, that would be equivalent to abortion. But it wouldn't be, because that would mean that conception would not occur. And abortion is not the prevention of conception. Abortion is not the prevention of reproduction. Abortion is when you kill the child that has already been conceived. But the bigger problem, as I've already pointed out, is that Talarico is simply making all this up. The word consent does not appear in the Gospel of Luke. The Archangel Gabriel appears and tells her that according to God's will, she is going to bear God's son. He doesn't say, do you consent? He tells her what's happening, and Mary replies, let it be to me according to your word. So she's enthusiastic about bringing a new life, Jesus' life, into the world. For James Talarico to twist this passage into a biblical endorsement of child murder up to and including the moment of birth is, it's demonic. That's what it is. There's no other way to describe it. The demonic wing of the Democrat Party isn't a wing anymore. It's the whole thing. It's the whole organization. This is nothing less than Satanism. To take that moment in Scripture and use it as a argument for abortion is what a Satanist would do. That is Satan. It's like something you would, if you went to a satanic temple and listened to their homily, that's the kind of thing you would hear. Now, the problem Talarico has is that for an alleged moderate, he's no longer capable of talking like a normal human being. And if you listen to enough of his sermons, that liability becomes very obvious. Watch.
This summer, more than half our population became second-class citizens. Every one of our neighbors with a uterus became the property of the state. And nothing is more unchristian than that. Before we go further, I want to acknowledge that our trans community needs abortion care too. Defending trans Texans is something we have to do every day at the state capitol. And you better believe I'll be giving sermons on that too. So when I use the word woman, it should not be understood as an exhaustive term, but rather as a lens through which to understand, examine, and interrogate patriarchy.
You know, the other thing you notice when you look at these clips of James Talarico preaching to his fake church, his uber, insanely leftist fake church. The other thing you notice, aside from all the nonsense that he's spewing, is you can see the congregation, and what do you see? Number one, very sparsely attended, and the average age of the attendance is like 70. And that also tells you something, and that's the way that it goes with these liberal churches. Are all, that's kind of the good news, is that they're all literally and figuratively dying. But anyway, he says, our neighbors with a uterus became the property of the state. When I use the word woman, it should not be understood as an exhaustive term, but rather as a lens through which to understand, examine, and interrogate patriarchy. It's like ChatGPT in a human skin suit. Nothing he's saying makes sense. In a matter of seconds, he managed to find several dehumanizing ways to refer to women. Neighbors with a uterus. They're not really women. They're a lens. What big tent is going to show up and vote for this guy exactly? How many neighbors with penises and neighbors with uteruses will go to polls to elect this? Nothing about James Talarico comes across as even human. That includes this tweet where he pretends to be happy about receiving the single worst Christmas gift that anyone has ever received, although, of course, he didn't really receive it. He bought it for himself. But there it is right there. Quote, "I got the coolest action figure for Christmas. Thank you to all the healthcare superheroes working today. Let's help by getting vaxxed and boosted." And then there's the picture of the Tony Fauci action figure with a mask on its face, which, of course, is exactly what Texans want to see. You know, all those Texans with their pickup trucks and their Anthony Fauci action figures. They also love hearing that there should be a giant welcome mat on the southern border. Watch.
How do you balance your feelings toward ICE versus the people you would represent who support deporting undocumented immigrants? You have 30 seconds.
So my family is from the border. My mom grew up in Laredo, Texas. I feel like Texans understand this issue of immigration more so than people in other states because we live with it, both the benefits and the challenges. So what I've said is that our southern border should be like our front porch. There should be a giant welcome mat out front and a lock on the door. We can welcome immigrants who want to live the American dream. We can build a pathway to citizenship for those neighbors who have been here, making us richer and stronger, and we can keep out people who mean to do us harm.
Now, the thing is, we don't just want to keep out people who mean to do us harm. The intention of the foreigners isn't actually important. What's important is that, as a practical matter, our country cannot survive if we import every foreigner who wants to come to the United States. Our welfare system especially can't survive it, for one thing. And on top of that, this is our country. We're entitled to run our own country. And if we import millions of foreigners who will eventually outnumber us, then we're losing our country. And therefore, we can and must exclude foreigners even if they do not wish to do us harm. We can go on and on. I mean, there's also the post where he states that radicalized white men are the greatest domestic terrorist threat in our country. There's the post where he states that, thankfully, he didn't turn out to be a domestic terrorist because he was exposed to diversity at a young age and explicitly taught the values of equality, inclusion, and justice. But instead of more Talarico posts and videos, we'll close with this interview featuring Steve Toth, who just defeated Dan Crenshaw in the primary for Texas' 2nd congressional district. Toth worked with Talarico for many years in the state government. And here's what he said. Watch.
I put forth legislation to secure our elections. It gets killed by the Democrats. When I put forth legislation to end the social transition of children, it gets killed by the Democrats. It's evil. Talarico is part of that group. I served with James Talarico from 2019 through to today. This guy is as evil as they come. There is a darkness to this man's life that if you doubt that there's a wickedness and an evil and a demonic presence in the world, you only have to look at James Talarico. He is an awful, awful person. Awful person.
Well, there's no reasonable person in the state of Texas who can disagree with that assessment. I mean, the moment you get any familiarity with Talarico, it's very obvious. And on that point, you have to give the Republicans some credit here. Throughout the entire primary, the Republicans stayed silent as Democrats sold Talarico as a normal guy. Republicans had the opposition research in hand. There's a lot of it and more. They knew about all of Talarico's tweets and videos and sermons, but they held their fire so that Democrats would elect him as a moderate without having any idea what they were getting into. At least a lot of the voters didn't. Now, as it stands, Democrats are all but certain to lose this race in November. But as much as I want to gloat over these revelations about Talarico, I simply can't do so. It's a very troubling development that this demonic force just received a major party's nomination to represent one of our most important states in the U.S. Senate. Just like as much as I'd like to gloat over Jasmine Crockett's loss, and believe me, I do want to gloat, and I did gloat actually already, the satanic theater kid who beat her is somehow 100 times worse. He's just an absolute depraved, evil freak. There's no other way to put it. At least Jasmine was kind of funny because she's so dumb, but Talarico is deeply sinister. His goal, and the goal of the Democrat Party in the midterms ahead, is to recast their anti-American, anti-human ideology as fully compatible with Christianity. And it's not, and it never will be. Christianity is the natural enemy of trans ideology. It's the natural enemy of Gnostic heresy, abortion, wanton destruction of human life of all kinds, and leftism. Rather than move towards sanity, a move that was desperately needed in the Democrat Party, a move that we were told was happening, they've decided to double down on these evils, all while claiming to be moderates. Democrats spent an enormous amount of time and money boosting Talarico because they see his approach as the future of their party. They think they can fool the entire country, as they apparently fooled primary voters in Texas on Tuesday. For the sake of Western civilization itself, we simply cannot fall for it in November.